Coyote used the drainage line the way a practiced thief uses a ditch beside a lit road, low, unseen, and always moving where the ground made hiding easy. The drainage line wasn't much to look at in daylight. A shallow channel cut through the pasture and ran toward the creek, lined with reed grass and willows that grew crooked from flood years. In spring it carried brown water and foam. By late summer it held only damp soil and a thin ribbon of shade. But it did one important thing every season, every day. It broke the open field into a blind seam. That seam was where trouble travelled. Evan McCready noticed the calves first, not the coyote. At sunrise, he drove the old side-by-side out to the south pasture with a thermos of coffee rolling in the cup holder and the radio low enough that he could still hear the land. The air smelled like dry clover and dust, and that faint mineral tang you got when night dew was burning off fast. Cows stood scattered across the slope, heads down. The calves should have been scattered too, sleepy, curious, drifting in small, messy groups like they always did when the world felt safe. Instead, they were bunched. 20-some calves pressed shoulder to shoulder near the centre of the pasture, clustered tight against 3 heifers that weren't their mothers because fear didn't care about family. A few calves bleated without moving. Their ears were pointed forward, then sideways, then forward again, trying to decide where danger lived. Evan slowed the vehicle and watched. He didn't honk. He didn't shout. The first rule of livestock and predators was that you never made the herd's anxiety bigger than it already was. Anxiety made cattle run into fences, stampede into creeks, trample their own young. You could lose more calves to panic than you did to teeth. He cut the engine and listened. The pasture was quiet in the ordinary ways. Birds, a distant truck on the county road, the soft tear of grass in cow mouths. But near the drainage line, down where the willows thickened, there was a different quiet. Not silence exactly, just a pocket where sound didn't feel welcome. His dog, Mags, sat in the passenger seat with her nose up, sniffing. She was an old blue heeler with a cloudy left eye and the steady patience of an animal who had worked alongside humans long enough to learn their patterns and their mistakes. Mags gave a low, uncertain whine. Evan's stomach tightened. He stepped out and walked toward the bunched calves, staying slow, hands relaxed, eyes scanning the drainage line and the willow edges. The cows watched him with dull, calm eyes. Cows didn't panic quickly. Calves did. Calves acted like the world was full of surprises because, for them, it was. He counted heads automatically. He always did. 24. That was the right number. No calf missing, no blood on the grass, nothing that demanded a siren inside his head. Still, the bunching wasn't normal. It was a behaviour you saw after a storm, after a dog got loose, after something ran the fence line in the dark. Evan crouched and examined the ground near the calves' cluster. Hoof prints overlapped in tight circles, churned enough that the grass was torn. The pattern looked like a crowd trying to become one body. Predator pressure. His eyes moved to the drainage seam. He walked down the slope until he reached the edge where the field dropped into the channel. The reeds were taller here, the soil darker. The willows formed a thin screen that hid the channel from anyone standing in the pasture proper. Evan pushed aside a branch with the back of his hand and looked down. Tracks. Not deer, too narrow in the heel. Not dog, too elongated, too clean in the pad. The prints showed claws lightly, and the stride was straight and confident. A line of small, precise canid tracks ran along the damp bottom of the drainage like someone had walked a hallway. Evan followed them with his eyes until they vanished under a bend where the willows tightened. Coyote. The word didn't scare him the way it scared people who watched too many news clips. Coyotes had always been here. They were part of the landscape the way rocks and wind were. Most of the time they hunted mice and rabbits and whatever else the land gave up cheaply. But calves were different. Calves were slow and soft and made noise. Calves were opportunity. Evan straightened and looked back at his herd. The cows had shifted, subtly, closing around the calves the way a group of adults closes around kids when a stranger enters a room. It wasn't sentimental, it was instinct shaped by thousands of years of predation. The cows didn't know, Coyote, they knew pressure. He pulled his phone from his pocket and checked service. 2 bars. Enough. He called his neighbor, Lila Hart, who ran the adjoining pasture and had more experience with predators than anyone in the valley because she'd spent 10 years working wildlife damage control before she came back to ranching. She answered on the first ring. "Morning." "You got coyotes moving the drainage?" Evan asked. There was a pause that was all attention. "Why?" "Calves are bunched in the south pasture," he said. "Found fresh tracks in the ditch line. Straight run. Recent." Leela exhaled once. "Yeah," she said. "Had one working my fence last night. Heard it yip once, then quiet. That's the one I don't like." "Quiet one?" Evan asked. "Quiet ones are the ones that hunt," she said. "You got any missing?" "Not yet." "Then you're early," Lila replied. "Good. Keep it that way." Evan looked toward the willows again. "What do you think? Solo or pair?" Lila didn't answer immediately. "Track size?" "Medium, not huge." "Could be female," Lila said. "But the behavior matters more. If calves are bunched in daylight, it's been testing at night. Might be more than one." Evan felt the familiar annoyance rise. At the animal, at the situation, at the fact that keeping livestock alive always came down to constant vigilance. "What's your move?" he asked. Lila's voice stayed practical. "Pressure back," she said. "Lights don't help in pasture. People help. Noise helps, if it's consistent. And don't let that drainage line stay a free highway. Trim it, open sight lines. If they can't move unseen, they spend more energy and take less risk." Evan glanced at the willows. "That's a lot of trimming." "Cheaper than losing calves," Lila said, as if reading his mind. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Always the answer. Always the math," she corrected. "I can swing by later. We'll walk sign." "Yeah," Evan said. "Do that." He hung up and stood for a moment, letting the morning settle around him. The pasture looked peaceful if you didn't know how to read it. That was the problem with predators. They didn't change the landscape, they changed the meaning of it. He drove back to the barn and made adjustments that felt small but were actually the difference between a calm day and a dead calf. He moved the mineral block away from the drainage edge because calves drifted toward it, and drift was how you got singled out. He checked the fence where the drainage crossed under it, an old sagging section where flood debris had pushed wires apart. He tightened it and stapled fresh wire ties until his fingers hurt. Then he set up a battery-powered motion light near the barn lot, not because coyotes were afraid of light, but because it gave him information at night. Information was what mattered. That evening, Evan didn't eat dinner with the TV on. He ate quickly, then walked the pasture edge at dusk with mags and a handheld spotlight. He didn't go into the pasture. He stayed along the perimeter where he could see the drainage seam and the cattle in one view. The calves stayed bunched even as they lay down, packed in a tight oval like they were sharing body heat. Their mothers stood nearby, heads up, chewing slowly but scanning more than chewing demanded. The herd was doing its job. Evan listened. Coyotes, when they wanted to be heard, were easy to find. Their yips and howls carried far and turned a quiet valley into something that sounded crowded. But this evening there was no chorus. No playful yapping, no announcement. That was what Lila meant. The hunting ones moved like smoke. Around full dark, Evan walked to the drainage crossing and aimed the spotlight down into the reeds. The beam cut a bright tunnel through willow leaves, then stopped at the bend. Nothing moved. Mags stiffened, nose pointed low, then turned her head sharply left as if tracking a scent line on the air. A low growl started in her throat, small but serious. Evan froze. He didn't shine the light wildly. He held it steady and followed Mags's attention toward the far side of the drainage, where the willow screen met the fence corner. A shape paused there, not a dramatic silhouette, just a low pale grey form in the fringe of light, half hidden by grass. It stood still long enough for Evan to register pointed ears and a narrow chest. Then it stepped back, slipping into darkness with a smoothness that made his skin prickle. Coyote. One, maybe more behind it. Evan didn't chase, he didn't yell, he simply raised the spotlight and swept the beam along the drainage line, slow and deliberate, forcing the predator to keep moving. Coyotes didn't like being observed, not because they were afraid of humans in some moral sense, but because being seen made hunting inefficient. Efficiency was their currency. He used a handheld air horn, 3 short blasts, then waited. The sound punched through the night and rolled off the quarry ridge like a slap. Cows lifted their heads. Calves pressed closer. Mags barked once, harsh and confident. The coyote didn't appear again, but Evan didn't feel victory. He felt a temporary advantage. Predators returned when the reward was there. At 2:13 a.m., the motion light near the barn lot flicked on, throwing white glare over the gravel and casting sharp shadows under the feed trough. Evan woke instantly. He slept light during calving season the way people in storm zones slept light during hurricane months. He pulled on boots and stepped onto the porch with the rifle he kept for emergencies, not as a first plan. He hated the rifle because it meant the situation had moved beyond coexistence, but he also hated losing calves. The night air was cold enough to bite. The pasture lay black under a thin scatter of stars. Mags was already at the porch rail, body rigid. Evan raised the binoculars and scanned the lighted area. A coyote stood at the edge of the barn lot, frozen in the flood of the motion light like an actor caught in a spotlight. It wasn't large, it wasn't monstrous, it was just exactly what it was. Lean, clever, built to live on the margins. It stared toward the pasture, not toward Evan. Then, as if deciding the barn lot was the wrong risk, it turned and trotted away, slipping toward the drainage seam. Evan watched it vanish and felt a cold realization settle in his chest. It wasn't after chicken feed or garbage, it was checking angles, it was mapping routes. He didn't fire. Firing would teach it one lesson. Humans are loud and dangerous right here, and it would learn another lesson right alongside it. Avoid the barn lot, hunt the pasture edge where humans don't appear until daylight. He went back inside, wrote the time down on a notepad, and lay awake until dawn. In the morning, Lila arrived in her battered truck with a thermos and a spool of flagging tape. She hopped out like someone who didn't waste motion. "You look tired," she said, which in ranch country was just a factual observation, not sympathy. "Coyote hit my motion light at 2, Evan said. Lila's expression tightened. "Okay," she said, "so it's bold enough to scout close." They walked the drainage seam together. Lila moved like she was reading invisible text. She stopped at a spot where the willows formed a low tunnel and pointed at the dirt. 2, she said. Evan leaned in. 2 sets of tracks, one slightly larger, one smaller, moving together in parallel. The stride patterns were coordinated enough to suggest familiarity. "A pair," Evan murmured. Lila nodded. "Pair can test cattle better," she said. "One distracts, one flanks. They don't have to kill to create chaos. They just have to split one calf." Evan felt his jaw clench. "They haven't yet." Lila pointed farther along the seam, where the drainage widened into a shallow, muddy flat. "They tried," she said. There, the hoof prints showed a short burst of panic. Calf prints, small and erratic, then a tight circle where cows had stepped in, heavy and decisive. In the middle was a scuffed patch where something had lunged and missed. No blood, no hair, just the signature of an attempt. Evan exhaled. "Last night." "Yeah," Lila said. She straightened and looked across the pasture. The calves were bunched again, and now Evan could see the cost. Bunched calves grazed less. They grew slower. Stress took weight off them the way drought took water off grass. "This isn't just about one kill," Evan said, more to himself than to Lila. Lila nodded. "Predator presence is a tax," she said, "even when nothing dies." They made a plan that wasn't dramatic and therefore had a chance. They ran a temporary electric line along the pasture's drainage edge, 2 strands, low enough to discourage coyotes from slipping under, high enough not to snag calves. It wouldn't stop a determined predator forever, but it added friction. Friction made hunting expensive. They set up 2 additional motion lights farther down the seam, angled outward. Again, not to scare coyotes in some fairy tale way, but to show Evan where they moved. They shifted the herd's water trough and supplemental feed farther from the drainage, making the center of the pasture the comfortable place, not the edge. And they did the hardest thing. They opened the drainage line. Evan hated it because it meant cutting and hauling and sweating, because it meant changing the land rather than simply reacting to it. But he understood why it mattered. Coyotes used cover the way they used darkness. If the seam stayed blind, they owned it. So they cut willow branches back, they trampled reed grass down in a few key spots, they made windows. By the 3rd evening, the calves still bunched. Habit outlasted immediate danger, but the bunch loosened around the edges. A few calves began wandering a little farther, testing space. Cows still stood alert, but the constant tension had softened slightly. At dusk, Evan and Delilah sat on the tailgate of Evan's truck and watched the pasture the way people watched a shoreline for sharks. The sky went purple, then black. The first motion light flicked on down the seam. A coyote trotted into the edge of the beam, paused, and looked across the pasture. Evan saw it clearly now because the willows were trimmed and the sightline was open. The animal's posture was cautious, not panicked. It wasn't starving, it wasn't desperate, it was simply doing what it did, probing for a weak point. A second coyote appeared behind it, lighter in build. Lila lifted her chin. "There's your pair," she said. Evan didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't fire. He reached for the air horn and gave one long blast, then another. The coyotes flinched, turned, and slipped back into the drainage shadows. Not running, just withdrawing. Evan watched the darkness swallow them and felt something like relief, tempered by realism. They'd won a round, not a war. Over the next week, the calves began to spread again. The herd's behavior told Evan what the pasture felt like better than any camera did. Calves didn't understand coyotes, but they understood safety. Safety meant grazing. Safety meant sleeping with a little distance between bodies. The motion lights still triggered at night sometimes, but the coyotes stayed farther out. Their route shifted. They used the seam but moved quicker through it now, less willing to linger under observation. One morning, Evan found coyote tracks along the far fence line instead of the drainage. He followed them to a corner where the neighbor's field met a strip of brush and then stopped. Predators moved to wherever the friction was lowest. That wasn't moral, it was math. Lila came by again and checked the sign with him. "They'll keep testing," she said, "but you changed the equation." Evan looked out at the pasture, at calves grazing in loose groups again, at cows chewing calmly. He felt a tired satisfaction, not triumph, just a sense that the day might proceed without emergency. "They used the drainage line," he said. Lila nodded. "Because it was easy," she replied. "And the calves stayed bunched," Evan said. "Because they were smart," Lila corrected, and there was something almost tender in the way she said it, as if acknowledging that prey animals weren't stupid, they were simply honest about danger. That night, as the sun went down and the pasture cooled, Evan walked the drainage seam one more time. The cut willows smelled green and sharp. The electric line hummed faintly in his mind, even if it made no sound. The air held the ordinary noises again. He stopped where the seam bent toward the creek and listened. From far off, beyond the ridge, a single coyote yipped once, high, clear, almost casual. Then silence returned. Evan headed back toward the barn, boots steady, knowing the truth that every rancher eventually learned: you didn't eliminate predators from a landscape like this. You negotiated boundaries through effort and attention. You paid the tax in fencing, in lights, in lost sleep. And if you did it well, the calves could go back to being calves, messy, curious, scattered rather than a tight, trembling cluster that told you the hidden seam of the pasture had become a road for teeth.